And what we are seeing right now is the tragedy that I think symbolizes much of the tragedies that have been happening over the last 20 years. So in order to provide context, though, into what specifically is going on, we know that the U.S. invaded Afghanistan in 2001 after the attacks that occurred on 9/11. And largely what we saw was that, we fast forward, not to mask everything that's happening, but I want to explain and provide some context as to what's going on and why some folks to provide some context into some of what's happening. So what we saw was that in February 2020, President Donald Trump had signed a deal with the Taliban, and he had sent former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo out, and there are, these photos that you see, and they had signed a deal with the Taliban in February of last year, in which President Trump had committed that the U.S. would withdraw by May of this year. Now, in November, President Trump then announced his plan to cut down U.S. troops down to the level of 2,500 total by January of this year. And I think this partially really sets the stage of what we saw culminate in this August, which is in that deal with the Taliban, former President Trump had agreed to certain key conditions. And again, one of those conditions was a commitment to withdraw by May of 2020. The other condition is that he released about 5,000 Taliban prisoners, in addition, in almost an exchange for a ceasefire of sorts. So when you see that this figure kind of tossed around that U.S. troops, no U.S. casualties have happened since February of 2020, this was a condition of the deal that the Trump administration had struck with the Taliban last year. In exchange for withdrawal and release of these 5,000 troops, there was kind of this predicate of a ceasefire. And this was under the guise of a power sharing agreement between the Taliban and the Afghan government. Now, there are many other details and layers to this, including the argument that the Taliban themselves did not honor this agreement, et cetera. But that's kind of an overall sketch in terms of when people ask, why are things happening now? And why is this unfolding the way that it is? Now, what happened was that when President Biden first came into office in April, he announced that he was moving that withdrawal deadline from May 1st to September 11th, and making that commitment that U.S. troops would withdraw by September 11th of this year. Now, what we're seeing here is that that decision to move that date was an extension of that date, and these conditions were very, I would say, very fragile, because again, there was this ceasefire that was kind of put in place. And so this is when we really start seeing this very delicate time. And so in July of 2020, the United States left the largest air base in Bagram and announced a new withdrawal deadline of August 31st. And I believe that, again, this is because we were managing a very delicate situation, since that May 1st deadline was what the former president of the United States had committed to. So by August 6th, the Taliban took control of its first province. And on August 14th, U.S. evacuation began. By the next day, the Afghan government had fallen to the Taliban. And by August 27th, today, at least 104,000 people have been evacuated by the United States. And this is an unprecedented humanitarian mission. It is likely one of the largest and swiftest refugee evacuations in U.S. history. And again, this is about 104,000 people have been evacuated as of today. frankly, a matter of weeks. There are evacuations of tens of thousands of people happening each day. And again, in terms of what our office has been able to do, is that we are offering support to our constituents. If you are a service member, if you are a veteran, if you are an Afghan American, if you are a refugee from Afghanistan that is a constituent of mine, and you know individuals in Afghanistan that need help with evacuation, we have been assisting and coordinating with the Department of State and the Department of Defense in getting names and identifying people and bringing them over. And we received news just as recently as today that we have assisted family members of constituents in safely evacuating the country. And we are doing everything that we can to get as many people out that we are contacted with as quickly as possible. And so if you have names of people in the country, I urge you to please contact our office and get those names to us. In a refugee situation, and I believe that our congressional district, being over 50% immigrant and with large refugee populations, our district and our community understands, I would argue better than most, what the conditions of a refugee situation look like and feel like. And a lot of times when you are running and fleeing or have family members fleeing, you have little more than the clothes on your back. And so what we are trying to do is assist in creating documentation. We are offering letters of support so that people can make their case and at least be able to begin rebuilding their lives. In addition to that one-on-one support, I have led a letter along with Representative Barbara Lee in imploring the Biden administration to increase its national, our annual refugee cap and quota to a minimum of 200,000 refugees this year. This is not even an unprecedented number. Ronald Reagan admitted more, but it would be more than Presidents Trump, Obama, and George W. Bush as well. And so, I think it's extremely important that the United States really take responsibility for our actions and our interventionist foreign policy in Afghanistan over the last 20 years. And when we choose to engage in that policy, we should assume the responsibility of increasing refugee cap numbers where the United States has a military presence. I believe that is the absolute least that we can do. And for many, for those who argue against that, who argue against admitting Afghan refugees to the United States, I would like to remind you all, and I would like to remind those folks that that many of these Afghan nationals are people who trusted the United States. They worked with U.S. military. They believed the U.S. military when members of our military gave them promises that we would protect them. And it is now our responsibility to hold up on that promise. And this isn't just, I can't even stress enough that this isn't just a left or right issue. This isn't just an immigration advocacy issue. I have had many service members contact me over the last 2 weeks, including kids that I went to middle school with that then later enlisted in the military, asking us, whether everyone from U.S. Marines and veterans and beyond, asking us to please raise the refugee cap and what they can do to help us do that. And so the calls for this, I think, are across the board. We must increase the refugee cap. And this refugee cap is 200,000. And it doesn't just, that 200,000 minimum, which, I believe that it should be higher, but that 200,000 minimum is not just for Afghan nationals. It is the total cap. which means this includes climate refugees and environmental disaster refugees from Haiti and beyond. We are also advocating and rolling out advocacy for the extension of TPS to Afghan nationals as well. So in terms of your resources, if you are a constituent, if you are a member of our community, and you know someone in Afghanistan that needs help, please contact either our office or contact the State Department hotline for US citizens, legal permanent residents, and at-risk Afghans trying to evacuate. So this is the number right here up on the screen. You can also feel free to contact our office, and we can also engage engage our liaisons on this case. And if you are a U.S. military service member or veteran, we also who is experiencing crisis right now, we also have our crisis line available to you if this applies to you or someone that you may know. And even if it is not at a point of crisis, I strongly, strongly encourage you all to check in with friends, family members, etc., that you know that either may have family in Afghanistan, may have served either diplomatically or with our military or beyond, because this is a very difficult and trying time. So that is my general word on this, and we'll be taking any additional questions in the Q&A. Next up, in terms of what we also want to discuss, is the latest updates on the infrastructure package and budget reconciliation. So earlier this week, there was kind of the House was called back from its typical August recess, and in order to vote on two things: advancing budget reconciliation bill, and passage of the House of the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. So let's start talking about the infrastructure package and budget reconciliation. And really, this is the Build Back Better Act. The budget reconciliation, it's this big word, but it's otherwise known as the Build Back Better Act. And what happened earlier this week is that we were voting to advance debate and moving forward on budget reconciliation. And what this means is that we have this overall framework that was approved in how we're spending our budget funds where. And now what we needed to do was to vote to advance to allow us to actually start drafting this legislation and start allocating funds according to this overall framework. Now, there was a little bit of drama because I think it ended up being 10 conservative Democrats wanted to hold the Build Back Better Act hostage in order to get their infrastructure package prioritized and passed out of the gate. Now, why is this a bad thing? The reason this is a bad thing is that from the very, very beginning, a deal was struck that the conservative infrastructure package had to be paired with the more visionary Build Back Better Act in order for it to pass. The reason for this is because conservatives, and I mean conservative Democrats, as are partnering with the Republican Party in order to try to pass an infrastructure package that it frankly is anti-climate and was drafted by ExxonMobil, essentially. And we know this because an ExxonMobil lobbyist was caught on videotape, bragging about the fact that he has these Democrats on speed dial and the role that ExxonMobil played in trying to shape this legislation. So what they were trying to do, essentially, is pass this infrastructure package so that they can kill the budget reconciliation package, to kill the Build Back Better Act. Now, there are some investments in this infrastructure package that are good, that are frankly, we will not object to. Things like climate resiliency investments, investing in infrastructure that can help communities build seawalls or help rebuild infrastructure that is being threatened by climate change. We don't object to that. In fact, we think that this infrastructure package is underinvesting in those needs. Investments in things like trying to rebuild elements of our national power grid, we don't object to that. There are other parts of this bill that I think are extremely alarming. Things like partnering with private equity in order to allow states to auction off toll roads, et cetera, as well as sneaky language where they talk about putting billions of dollars in tax breaks for quote unquote carbon capture technology. Carbon capture sounds nice, right? And this is what fossil fuel lobbyists are experts at. They are experts at branding certain tax breaks to sound like they're climate friendly when they're really fossil fuel wish lists. And so some of the issues with carbon capture tax subsidies is that we saw in California that fossil fuel companies will use certain language drafted on the premise of carbon capture technology to essentially help themselves drill more oil. And that is, as we know, the last thing that we need, as we saw from the most recent IPCC report, that we are at code red for humanity and for our future. So the argument here is that if the infrastructure package, if the conservative infrastructure package alone was passed alone, not only would it be not enough, but it could potentially be actively harmful. What makes up for the infrastructure package is the Build Back Better Act. The Build Back Better Act and budget reconciliation will allow us to make the actual investments in climate that can help us draw down emissions. It will expand Medicare to include vision and dental healthcare, vision, dental, and hearing and vision, I believe. Yeah, vision, dental, and hearing in Medicare. So expanding your Medicare, if you are benefiting from Medicare right now, the Build Back Better Act will expand it so that you can get your dental care taken care of, hearing and vision assistance taken care of as well. The Build Back Better Act will also help establish universal pre-K across the country. Here in the United States, or rather, I wish in the United States overall, but here in New York City, we have seen how universal pre-K has benefited many families, but this will help us make it national. And as we know, New York City, universal pre-K is something that started to roll out in the city, but even the whole state doesn't get to benefit from that. And so it's really important that we get universal pre-K, as well as so many other critical investments, including one key area that we're fighting for, which is also the establishment of a civilian climate corps. So the argument here is that we have to pair both of these things, and because frankly, we need each other. We cannot escape or get past the fact that we need those conservative votes in order to pass the Build Back Better Act, but those conservatives need progressive votes in order to pass their infrastructure package. So by pairing both of these things together is the only way that we can guarantee passage of both. And so what conservative Democrats tried to do this week is hold the whole situation hostage, when this has been the agreement from the very beginning. There's been several months. This was the established course several months ago. And these 10 conservative Democrats essentially attempted to put a stick of dynamite into all of this in order to essentially sabotage President Biden's infrastructure agenda. And so I want you all to know well in advance that I have zero intention of participating in this charade. And I will not vote for a conservative infrastructure package alone. We must have budget reconciliation. We must pass the Build Back Better Act. And I will not vote for a conservative infrastructure package unless we have a Build Back Better, aka this budget reconciliation package that goes above and beyond that is going to help people's lives. That is what it is. And it's extremely important that this is a strategy. I'm telling you this in advance because I will likely get criticized for it. We will likely be criticized for it. And there will likely be an attempt to use media and headlines, et cetera, in order to try to pressure us into approving an ExxonMobil designed infrastructure package. And I will not do it. I refuse. Maybe those 10 Democrats rely on private equity and big money and lobbyist funding in order to preserve their careers in Washington. But thanks to you all, I don't. And I rely on my service to my constituents and everyday people and the support of everyday people in order to do my job. And so lobbyists don't tell me what to do. I listen to you all. And if they're going to fight for lobbyists and private equity interests, I'm going to fight for you harder. And so, this is lawmaking. It gets a little, rough and tumble sometimes, but I'm not going to blink first. That's for sure. So that is my promise to you. The other major opportunity that we have in budget reconciliation and the Build Back Better Act, which is another reason why I'm so staunch on this, is because this is one of our biggest opportunities to enact immigration reform and to create a path to citizenship for millions of people in this country and thousands of constituents right here at home in the Bronx and Queens. We're talking about pathways to citizenship for dreamers, TPS holders, farm workers, and essential workers who are undocumented. That is too precious and too important of an opportunity for us to allow to sail by. And so what I am asking for you all is for your support as we hold strong, because this is going to get tough. This is going to get difficult. And it's going to happen. The showdown is going to happen in late September. So I, as your representative, am letting you know that in late September, it might get a little ugly. But this is because this is what we're fighting for. We are fighting for a path to citizenship. We are fighting for climate investments so that we can reduce our carbon emissions in dramatic ways by 2030 and 2035. And we're doing this so that you can get expanded Medicare and expanded childcare. These to me are so worth it. And that is just really the tip of the iceberg of everything else that's in the Build Back Better Act, including the Civilian Climate Corps, including public housing investments, including assistance for homeowners. There is so much more in the Build Back Better Act. And so if it gets ugly in late September, I just want you all to know in advance, this is what we're fighting for. And this is why we are holding out, because it's a unique opportunity and it is worth it. And we do not know what the future holds for us. We don't know what the outcome of the 2022 elections are. We don't know. And so what we know is that we have this chance right now, and we need to push as hard as we possibly can. So that's that on that. Next after this, we have, let's see.
Sorry to interrupt you, Congresswoman, really quickly before moving on to the next slide. I just wanted to ask if you could speak a little slower so our interpreters can finish giving all of this really important information.
You got it. Thank you. All right. So next up, we have emergency rental assistance. So earlier this month, the CDC under the Biden administration allowed the existing then eviction moratorium to expire, and Congress also did not act before breaking for August recess. They did not act on extending the eviction moratorium. This to myself and to Representative Cori Bush, as well as Representatives Ayanna Pressley, Ilhan Omar, Mondaire Jones, Jimmy Gomez, and many other representatives in the US Congress, was utterly unacceptable. And so this is kind of the middle school stuff sometimes that we see in Congress. There are some people, very likely, there's probably very likely overlap with those 10 conservative Democrats that I was telling you about earlier, and the folks that did not want to extend the national eviction moratorium. But essentially what we know is that there were folks that would have rather have left town than actually cast a vote on whether we should extend the national eviction moratorium. So instead of voting to extend it, and I don't mean voting yes or no, but just voting at all, they didn't want to cast their vote. They decided to leave town. And so myself and some of the other representatives that I mentioned earlier said that is completely unacceptable, and we helped lead a protest on the steps of the Capitol. Myself and Cori Bush and many others slept on the steps of the Capitol for several days, and in order to create the political pressure necessary to prompt the Biden administration to extend the moratorium. And we were successful. And I want to thank many of our constituents, because there was actually a decent amount of constituents that hopped on buses that we provided from here in our district down to Washington, D.C. to also lend their support. And we were successful. And so what we did and what those actions resulted in was eviction protections for 11 million Americans for the month of August. Now, what happened last night was that the Supreme Court overturned the moratorium, and they ended the federal moratorium and said that it could not continue. Now, some people would say, see, there you go, we told you so. But to those folks who say that it was not worth it, I say that protecting 11 million people, even if it's for the month of August, is worth it. Now, the question is, what do we do now? Now the Supreme Court has overturned the moratorium, we need to do two things. One, we need to make sure that we push and advocate for New York's moratorium to be reinstated and extended, and to extend that and try to figure out what we can do to protect renters statewide. Secondly, we must also pressure Congress once again to take that vote. The reason that the Supreme Court is overturning this moratorium, and even when they warned the first time that they might, is because members of Congress do not want to cast this vote. And we have to say, listen, we must cast this vote. And here is why. In the last several COVID packages, both under the Trump administration and during the Biden administration, we authorized an emergency rental assistance program. Now, when we look at back rent in the United States, we're looking at something like a total debt of about $21 billion. Congress authorized $46 billion in order to pay people's back rent across the country. So we allocated more funds than was even necessary at that time, because we were anticipating future need due to the ongoing pandemic. Now, what is happening is that those funds were given to states to allocate. And particularly under the Cuomo administration, not $1 was sent out in emergency rental assistance as of about June, late June or early July, I believe. Now Governor Hochul has taken over. I have been in contact with the governor, and we have discussed how we get these funds out to mom and pop landlords and tenants as quickly as possible. But we need time. It is extremely important that people are able to get the assistance that they need, that people can, that mom and pops can pay their landlords and that tenants don't have, and that we can wipe out back rent for tenants. Now, here is the issue here. And here's where I also need your help. About 800,000 New Yorkers are eligible for emergency rental assistance. That's almost 1 million people. 800,000 New Yorkers are eligible. From the data that we have today, only 160,000 New Yorkers have applied for emergency rental assistance. And here is the deal. Moratorium or no moratorium, applying for emergency rental assistance, not even if you've gotten it yet, just applying helps give you protection against eviction. So I am asking you, I am begging you, if you have back rent that you owe and you have not yet applied for emergency rental assistance, please go to this website that is listed right here and apply. If you know someone, if you have family, if you have friends, if you have coworkers, just please, we're going to drop this link in the chat. Please just copy this link and put it in your notes app in your phone and just text it to people that you know may need this help. Because right now, especially with the overturning of the eviction moratorium, applying alone can give you legal protections from eviction. And so please, 800,000 people in New York State alone are eligible for emergency rental assistance, but only 160,000 people have applied. So that's, about one in 4, 1 in 5-ish, 1 in 6-ish people. Sorry, I shouldn't have engaged in ratios on live TV as I'm talking to you all, but essentially out of 160K, 800,000 are eligible, only 160K have applied. So we need to bump those numbers up. If you owe any back rent at all, please apply with this link. The criteria is getting easier the criteria is getting easier in order to apply. There used to be all this red tape. Either if you were a mom and pop landlord trying to make sure that you scrape something together for to pay a mortgage, or if you are a tenant, we are just trying to make sure that people are guaranteed in their right to housing. So please, please, please apply for this emergency rental assistance. Again, applying alone, even if you haven't gotten your check yet, can protect you from eviction. So that is that. Again, take this link, put it in your notes app so that you have it when you're talking to someone at work, when you're talking to your neighbor, etc. And please know that, especially when it comes to issues of finances, when it comes to issues of owing money and back rent, that you are not alone. This is like one of the most common conditions that people are in during the pandemic. Do not let shame keep you from getting financial help. Please just click on the link and apply. We're here for you, and we're doing everything that we can to ensure that we get this protection. And with that, we'll dive straight into our Q&A.
Thank you for your remarks, Congresswoman. We will now move to the Q&A portion of our town hall. As mentioned earlier, constituents signed on via the Zoom platform may use the Q&A feature to submit your questions. Please mention what neighborhoods or city you're from, as we prioritize questions from constituents. Also, a reminder to the members of the press that after the Q&A, there will be a press gaggle where you will be able to pose questions. Okay, so for the questions so far, the first question is from Tyretta Foster, who is a constituent from Allerton, who asks for you to please discuss the U.S. response to the earthquake in Haiti and other natural disasters occurring in the Western Hemisphere.
So thank you so much. What we saw this month in Haiti was and continues to be absolutely devastating. In terms of the actual tactical updates on the ground, the White House has led on immediate disaster relief in what is going on the ground. So USAID has a 97-person disaster assistance response team that has been allocated to Haiti on the ground, and it is working with interagency and humanitarian partners. And the focus right now, because we are still very much in the aftermath of disaster, is those priorities in food assistance, healthcare, logistics support, shelter, water, sanitation, etc. But what I talked about earlier in lifting that refugee cap includes not just what we are seeing in Afghanistan, but it also includes lifting that refugee cap in order for us to accommodate refugees from Haiti. And so in terms of our end, we are very much pushing to boost the refugee cap so that more Haitians are eligible to apply for refugee status in the United States if that is what they wish to do. And in terms of a larger legislative position, this is why I have been pushing on creating a new category of visa, and why we've been working on drafting legislation to create a new category of visa for climate refugees. Because as you alluded to in your question, these issues are increasingly not just affecting Haiti, although this is an issue of natural disasters, but also climate disasters as well will continue to start affecting the Southern Hemisphere writ large, from Latin America to Bangladesh to southern portions of Africa increasingly, and beyond. And so in order to accommodate for what is going to be part of our new normal, which is increased migration and refugee activity due to climate and natural disasters, we believe and advocate for the creation of a new visa category for climate refugees. But beyond that, we're also advocating for the extension of TPS, temporary protected status for Haitians. Even though there is resistance from the Biden administration in doing so, they have been resistant on a lot of things, and that does not stop us. And we have been successful, even though the Biden administration has been resistant to many of our initial policy requests and demands. When we organize, we have often been able to overcome some of those objections and that resistance. And I believe that the eviction moratorium is one example of that, but there are many others. So I would say in sum, that's what we have with respect to our actions on Haiti.
Thank you for that answer, Congresswoman. The next question comes from Jeff Strickland, who is a constituent from Jackson Heights, who asks, what can you do and how can I help to push through national voting rights legislation?
So thank you so much, Jeff, thank you so much, Jeff, for your question. And I so appreciate it because I believe that it's just this crisis. Voting rights is a crisis that it can feel isn't being treated with the urgency that it deserves. Our democracy is under attack from the state level, from within, and from the bottom up. As we are seeing in Georgia, Texas, Arizona, states all across the country, there are, and in so many different ways, the right to vote is very much under attack. So in terms of latest updates, on Wednesday, I voted in the House, and the House successfully voted to advance the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Now, this is known as HR 4. It is not the same legislation as HR 1, which I would argue is, I don't want to frame these as competing pieces of legislation. They are complementary pieces of legislation. And so HR 4 is one major piece. And what it does is that it largely restores many of the aspects of the of the Voting Rights Act that has been gutted by the Supreme Court over the last several years. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act will restore all of those pieces like preclearance that the Supreme Court had struck down. Now, what H.R. 1 does is that it not only restores the Voting Rights Act, but it also adds many more provisions to help protect and guarantee the right to vote in the United States. Things like protections against partisan gerrymandering, so that we don't have what we are seeing, which is Republican states that are gerrymandering, that are overwhelmingly gerrymandering states in order to disenfranchise essentially Black and brown communities and Democratic leaning communities and break them up into Republican districts. And the reason I say that it's leaning one way is because where independent commissions have been authorized, there are quite a few Democratic states that have authorized and passed on the state level these independent redistricting commissions. Very few Republican states have passed similar commissions. And so this kind of has created an uneven playing field where red states can engage in partisan gerrymandering. And there are many more blue states that have independent commissions. And so what we need to do is get everyone on a level playing field so that we can just combat this overall partisan gerrymandering. So H.R. 1 includes things like that. It also gets dark money out of politics. And this, I think, is why there has been so much resistance to passage of H.R. 1 among even some Democrats who rely on big and dark money. But it also includes really great provisions like guaranteed early registration, mail-in voting protections, and so on and so forth, which we don't even have, or same-day registrations, which we don't even have yet here in the state of New York, some of these provisions. And so we would greatly benefit from that. So in terms of the odds on this, here are some of the things that we know, is that, as I mentioned on Wednesday, we passed H.R. 4, we passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Earlier this year, we also passed H.R. 1. So the House has passed both pieces. Now we have the Senate. In the Senate, there are certain conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema who do not support H.R. 1. I personally believe that a lot of this has to do with dark money and the checks on eliminating and really curtailing the power of lobbyists and dark money, but that's an aside. Nevertheless, there is resistance to passing H.R. 1 among Democrats in the Senate. What they have said is, we will not pass H.R. 1. I have resistance to H.R. 1, but we are open to H.R. 4, that's the second part of the puzzle, the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. And so what the House has done is that we just passed H.R. 4 this week to see if some of these conservative Democrats will keep their word in passing that. H.R. 4, again, has those pre-clearance provisions in order for us, as we go into redistricting this year, to help protect against some of not just some of these issues with respect to gerrymandering, but also just changes to voting rights writ large, which, as we also saw this week, the state of Texas recently passed very draconian and extremely alarming provisions to attack the right to vote in the state of Texas. And so the John Lewis Voting Rights Act will help reestablish that preclearance. And from there, we hope that when the Senate reconvenes, they pass it as quickly as possible, because the timing on this is extremely sensitive. The census data was just handed over about 2 weeks ago. And with that data, states are starting to gear up for the process of redrawing district lines, even here in the state of New York. So this coming year, next year, all of us are going to be receiving new state assembly lines, potentially new state assembly lines, new state Senate district lines, new federal congressional district lines. And so I hope I will continue being your representative. It's possible that I might be more people's representative, you know, if everything, you know, goes okay. But on that note, I will say that also our community's participation in the census, thanks to the efforts of many organizers on the ground and people in our community's participation in the census was one of it really beat expectations. And in fact, it was in the top 10. Both Queens and the Bronx had higher than expected. It's had some of the highest levels of above expected census turn-in numbers, which actually dramatically changes what was expected for our congressional district. So I want to thank everybody in our community. I know I was talking everyone's ear off about the census last year in town hall after town hall, but it worked. All of us worked together. We flyered, we leafleted, we did as much as we possibly could. And what that means now is because we were so successful in filling out the census last year, our representation will be protected. We are going to get more funding for schools. We're going to get more funding for our hospitals, for our bridges, for our roads, and everything locked in for the next 10 years. So I want to thank you all so much for filling out and turning in your census, because we were in the top 10 communities in the country when it came to beating expected and estimated turnout.
So we have received many questions on unemployment, including from Liz Gardner, who's a constituent from Sunnyside, who asked, are there any programs that will replace the federal $300 a week extra unemployment benefit and the Biden Rescue Plan COBRA coverage, which will both end in September?
So this is something that I'm thanking you all so much for bringing up this issue. I cannot understate the importance on, if you know friends or family in other congressional districts, to call your representative and ask them about this issue as well. And so to lay out the kind of overall framework here and the context for this, as Ms. Gardner correctly notes, in the American Rescue Plan and in this COVID package, there was a $1.9 trillion economic stimulus package that not only provided that $1,400 stimulus check earlier this year, but it also included PPP, that child tax credit that started rolling out in July, but it also allowed for that $300 a week bump in the pandemic unemployment assistance, as well as a 100% subsidy for COBRA recipients through September. Now, as Ms. Gardner had correctly noted, these are scheduled to phase out in September. And I have been a very vocal proponent of extending these benefits. The pandemic is far from over, and I think one of the reasons we saw the phase out from this original phase out was scheduled for September was because of two things. One, the Delta variant had not yet exploded or taken off. And B, the vaccine rollout was just starting, and people thought that adoption of the vaccine was going to really help phase out and bring COVID down to a much more manageable level. Well, two things happen. One is that the degree of misinformation and fear, et cetera, Facebook misinformation and disinformation, et cetera, and the low levels of vaccine adoption among certain, in certain geographic areas in the country and beyond, has made COVID harder to contain. And then secondly, the Delta variant's emergence has also made it very, very difficult to contain as well. So what happens So first of all, if you have not been vaccinated yet, and you have any questions about the logistics of vaccination, it is free. So I just want to remind folks that the vaccine is 100% free. You do not need to have insurance to get vaccinated. And also, New York State and our city has paid leave for getting vaccinated. And so I know a lot of people are very concerned because you can't afford to have that extra day off work due to downtime, etc. We have passed paid leave for you to get your COVID vaccine. And so if having downtime from work is a concern, or if affordability or your insurance status is a concern, I want to clear those two things up for you right away, that it is free, and that yes, that the vaccine is free, and that you can get paid sick leave in the state of New York in order to get it. Now, that being said, the emergence of the Delta variant and the struggles that some communities have with adoption has extended the pandemic further. And so what we've been advocating for is to extend the pandemic unemployment assistance. Now, what I will say, and I want to just be very transparent with you all, is that this sentiment is not shared among many members of Congress in both parties. And we need to create and make noise to make sure that every member of Congress and at least every Democrat can be more supportive of extending pandemic unemployment assistance. And even here in the state of New York, we at least have that pandemic unemployment assistance stacked on top of the state unemployment assistance. In many other states and Republican states, they have stopped doling out that unemployment assistance overall. And so people have been already cut off in other states, and it is just devastating. And they've cut off this assistance under the guise of saying, oh, frankly, a lot of this motivation is the idea that they can starve people back into work. And what we've seen from that data, as we know, is that is not effective. Sorry, I have some light around here, but that is not effective. And the data shows that even if that is kind of your cruel motivation, it's not even effective. It doesn't even work. Doing that does not boost employment numbers. It does not boost job seeking numbers at all, because we are in a pandemic. We're in a global pandemic, not to mention the fact that 600,000 people died, which naturally means that, which naturally is going to have some sort of impact on our labor force. And so all of this is to say is that I want you to know that as your representative, I very much support extension of unemployment, but I'll be honest, the Biden administration has not been out front in extending it. They have not been vocal about their desire to extend it. And many moderate Democrats have not been vocal about extending it either. And so what we need to do is that I think that there is this false idea in Washington, which can often be very disconnected from the real world, that this is not as urgent an issue as it actually is. And so I just implore you, I'm thanking you for bringing this up in this town hall so that you can get my commitment and get my commitment publicly. And I'm asking that if you know anybody that is represented by anybody else, to keep doing the same, because we need to get these commitments. And I think that more of my colleagues need to hear from their constituents with calls to their office. And I know I say this every time, but I cannot say enough how many times I hear my colleagues saying, well, no one's calling my office about unemployment assistance or extending it, so I just don't think it's affecting my district. And so I know I say it every time. I know that it sounds like someone telling you to floss or some other sort of practice that people don't always want to do. But call it really, truly does make a difference if certain representatives who are resistant are not getting these calls into their office, then they really don't think it's a, out of sight, out of mind, if it's like out of phone, out of reality for many of my colleagues. So please encourage your friends and family to call their representatives, leave a message, because people really go through and they tally how many calls they get on this. And if they're like, no one's calling me about this issue, they do not believe it is affecting their district. And so I want you to know that I'm fighting for this. The Progressive Caucus wants to fight for this. But the reality is that there are many Democrats that are not supportive of or do not feel a sense of urgency around extending it. And so we need to get them on board, and we need to get them hearing from more of their constituents that this is important.
Thank you for your answer, Congresswoman. Our next question comes from Carlos, who is a constituent and also a TPS holder. And he asks, what is your office doing or going to do to help TPS families?
So thank you for bringing this issue up. One of the things that we've been doing is that we have been very much calling on the Biden administration. As I've mentioned TPS earlier this year, we have been putting a lot of pressure, and we've been mobilizing around TPS with the Biden administration writ large in order to extend TPS protections that were not only imperiled during the last administration, but continue to be imperiled in this one. And so we've been doing a lot of work in that advocacy. We have voted to extend TPS in the House to many communities. And so I would say the thing about TPS is that it is so nationality specific, whether it's TPS with respect to Haiti, Haitians, Afghans, Hondurans, etc. So if you have a TPS constituency that you are mobilizing for specifically, please contact our office so that we can start strategizing together. But we've been very much in contact with our local and grassroots advocates on that writ large. And then in terms of our overall legislative strategy, one of the things that we're very focused on is creating a path to citizenship for all TPS holders and recipients. And that's also, by the way, in our budget reconciliation package. And what we're fighting for right now in the Build Back Better Act includes a path to citizenship for TPS holders.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for your answers. And also thank you to our constituents for asking questions. You can always contact our office by calling 718-662-5970. Now, moving on to the press gaggle. If you are a reporter and would like to ask a question, please click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen and state your name and outlet in the question field. Reporters who are selected will be unmuted so they can ask their question to the member directly. And we will also give the members of the press a couple of minutes to submit their names and questions. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and call on Kevin Frey from New York 1.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Great. Hi, Congresswoman. Thanks for doing this as always. Two quick things, if you'll indulge me. One, wanted to know your take on Senator Schumer and his various kind of progressive things that he's embraced, especially in the past year or so. Marijuana. He was out there with you on the eviction moratorium, canceling student debt, and so forth. What do you think of him backing all of this? Why do you think he is, and is he doing enough? And then secondly, this Congress, you have in the delegation from New York alone a bunch of new colleagues on the progressive end of things, including Bowman and the squad, and then of course Mondaire Jones. What is, in your view, the significance of those partnerships? How are you collaborating? What do you think you've been able to accomplish?
Well, on your first question, I am very excited about some of the work that we have started and collaborated with Senator Schumer on so far this year. As you know, there've been a lot of discussions in the last week or so, especially when it comes to infrastructure and reconciliation, this idea of landing the plane, right? And so what I think is really important is that I think we have a very exciting first step with Senator Schumer, getting on board with things like marijuana decriminalization and student loan forgiveness, et cetera. But we need to land the plane. We need to land the plane on them. We need to actually, it's a major step to have the Senate Majority Leader in Senator Schumer adopt these positions. Now we have to translate them into actually getting them done. So we need to land the plane on student loan forgiveness. We need to land the plane on decriminalization of marijuana. We need to land the plane on expansion of Medicare, land the plane on the establishment of Civilian Climate Corps. And that, I think, is not just what is my measure. I think that's the measure of all of our folks at home and members of our community. They think it's, we think it's nice and it's great. And this applies even for me. It's great to have the position. We need to actually get it done. And so my hope is that Senator Schumer uses his considerable and unique power in the Senate in order to make sure that we land the plane in actually changing people's lives for the better. That's what we're here to do. That's our unique purpose. And so we have a very unique opportunity. And that, includes having the ability to sometimes press the president where that is necessary. And so, I would say that is an important, that's going to be an important measure. Additionally, I think that when it comes to the really wonderful movement partners that we have added in the House with folks like Representative Mondaire Jones or Representative Jamal Bowman, it has created a significant shift in the U.S. House of Representatives, even just in one term. I would say that the addition in the numbers of people that New Yorkers, the numbers of representatives that New Yorkers are sending that are just boldly advocating for guaranteed health care, student loan forgiveness, huge action on climate and job creation and educational expansion is making a very significant shift in public policy. I can't understate it enough. I do not think child tax credits, these monthly child tax credits that folks are getting, I do not think that things like that would happen. I don't even think stimulus checks would happen without the election of individuals like Representative Jones and Bowman adding to the ranks of very vocal progressives, and not just people who are talking about it, but who are willing to leverage their power in order to get it done, who are willing to withhold their votes if it's necessary, who are willing to take political risks if it's necessary in order to deliver more for working people in this country. And so I can't overstate enough the immense impact that they're making. And frankly, I think that there is something to be said about the fact that New York is a progressive nexus in the House of Representatives in terms of the congressional delegation that we're sending. It's next level. And that is, I also just want to reiterate that that's also building on the advocacy of existing representatives like Nidia Velázquez, Representative Jerry Nadler, and so on and so forth in our delegation, because that pairing of new junior members like myself and Representatives Bowman and Jones willing to take those risks, when you pair that with the seniority of committee chairs in the New York City delegation, like Nydia Velázquez and Jerry Nadler, et cetera, who are also willing to take risks and legitimize this legislation and bold action, it creates a dynamic that I think is really important and critical in advancing legislation. I mean, Representative Velázquez she does not take the credit that she deserves for the responsibility that she has in the creation of the PPP program. Small businesses would not have had the lifeline in PPP the way that they did if her representation wasn't there and if New Yorkers didn't send her.
Okay, next up, we have Javier Castaño from Queens Latino.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Javier.
Basically, the assistance to pay the rent is to avoid homelessness. But here in our neighborhoods, such as Jackson Heights and Corona, there are a lot of homeless people living on the streets. And people start talking about quality of life issues like homelessness and also the noise and the garbage is not being cleaned. What the government is doing to stop the deterioration of the quality of life issues and your office?
Yeah, so I think a lot of these issues are very interconnected. And as you mentioned, the emergency rental assistance program and the eviction moratorium, and the reason that we advocate for those things is because without them, we will face an explosion in people who are experiencing either homelessness or profound housing instability. And that type of shift that type of instability is unacceptable. We do not want to see these in our communities. And what we see in public housing policies or housing policies in general, even in other countries, is that it's cheaper to simply provide housing to people experiencing homelessness than it is to establish this huge network of shelter systems and program assistance and all these other things, including not to mention the weight that it creates on our public health systems, because housing is a primary social indicator of one's health status. And so what they found is that simply getting engaged in the housing inventory and actually providing housing to people experiencing homelessness in public policy trials that we've seen in other countries is not only effective, but it is less expensive than everything that we're trying right now. We do have a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis that precedes COVID. And in fact, we have had some of the highest rates of homelessness in New York City pre-COVID and even before my election since the Great Depression. And so what do we do about this? First of all, we need to make sure that we are increasing not just the housing stock, but that we are actually building housing for people to live in and to stop. I believe that we need to be moving our tax system away from treating housing like a commodity for profit first, and that the number one most important use right now, I would argue that our tax system, our laws, our economy, et cetera, treats our housing stock, that the number one value in housing policy and tax policy, et cetera, is for housing to be used as profit instead of housing's number one value to be used for shelter and housing people. And so I think it's really important that we do things like make changes to the tax incentives and breaks where people getting a second home are treated better than many people who are attempting to get their first home. And I think that the hoarding of housing that we are seeing, especially by private equity groups, and these huge areas and these other huge dark money interests need to be confronted and curtailed. As we saw over the last year, people can't even buy their first home anymore. And even for my generation, I'm a renter. I don't even own a home because it feels so impossible. And this is not the way that housing should be. And so it's going to create a profound shift federally. And then particularly when it comes to quality of life issues, this was one of the reasons why we passed a record American Rescue Plan earlier this year with state and local funding, because many of the reasons that some people may see, for example, trash cans that were taken out of certain neighborhoods, like public trash cans or trash piling up, was because of the economic freeze that COVID had represented. That created dramatic cuts in tax revenues for cities and states. And the way that they tried to save money is by reducing certain public services, like the frequency of trash collection. And so what we have done and what my office has done was advocated for record state and local funding so that we could essentially transfer those funds to the city and to the state of New York, as well as cities and states across the country, so that we can start restoring the frequency of those services again. And again, it's not just limited to tax collection, trash collection. It also extends to investments in schools as we, try to reopen, safety measures, preserving families' abilities to remain safe, et cetera.
Thank you. The next question is from Matthew Russell Lee from Inner City Press. Does Representative Ocasio-Cortez think the administration's bank regulators have moved fast enough to increase scrutiny of redlining, predatory lending, and other abuses?
It's a pretty broad question because redlining practices vary a lot. So I'm going to go with no. They're not. I sit on the Financial Services Committee, and redlining is a generations old practice that has roots in the 1930s and 40s. And so there are many modern iterations of redlining and investments, and we've introduced many different pieces of legislation and co-sponsor and support many different pieces of legislation on this. But the fact of the matter is that I am not of the belief that banks are going to do the right thing on their own. I think that I don't even think we know that they are motivated towards profit. And there is a lot of profit in, I'll just take one small example. Appraisals of housing values. They are very often racist and discriminatory. We have seen Black families go in and get their homes appraised. And then when they send in, and they will get one number, and then when they send in a white family to act as them and get that same exact property, their home appraised, it will come in, the appraiser will come in at a much higher value. This is not an anecdote. We have seen studies in this. And one area, for example, that shows that impacts generational wealth and contributes to the racial wealth gap. Like, this is just one small piece of the much larger puzzle. Another area is our entire system of credit scores and reporting is corrupt. The folks that are issuing your credit score are the same folks, it's the same network and system of people who profit off of you having a low credit score. And so what happens is that there is an extraordinary incentive, and it's much easier to falsely report a negative event on your credit score. And it is much harder to get that fixed than to get have like, to have an accurate and even credit score without any inaccuracies. The amount of people with inaccuracies that are negatively affecting their credit score is astronomical. And the difficulty to get negative reports, even if they're false, removed from your credit score is extremely high. And so what that means is that there is a downward pressure on credit scores, because guess what? When you have a lower credit score, that allows a lender to charge you much higher interest so that they can profit off of the fact that you have a lower credit score. And who is reporting your payment history? Lenders. So there's kind of an issue here. So there are many different provisions that we can attack on this. We could talk about again, these are just two examples that are just scraping the surface on this issue. I believe that any system of credit related reporting, there should be a public alternative to. It does not make any sense that these are private entities. And I believe that credit reporting must be much more tightly regulated. But again, these are just two examples of just scratching the surface. If there are specific areas of advocacy within this larger realm that you are interested in, please contact our office and we'd be happy to take it up.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman. Unfortunately, we are out of time, so I do apologize for not being able to get to everyone's question. Thank you so much to our constituents for joining us. Your engagement is what allows us to continue to fight for you in Congress. I also want to thank our transcribers, Kara Camacho and Wendy Boer, as well as a big thank you to our interpreters, Aldo Resindiz, Shivita Special, Edward Lau, Roshan Ara, Yakub Ali, Mega Lama, and Niraj Gutam. Again, you can always contact our offices by calling 718-662-5970. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Gabriela. And thank you to all of our interpreters. We so appreciate all of your work. And we're doing it again in 5 languages in this town hall. It has been simultaneously translated in 5 languages. We have English, Spanish, Nepali, Bangla, and Chinese. So thank you all so much.